Thank you for tuning in to this first of 4 YouTube seminars, Recovering and Rebuilding from Depression and Anxiety. Our presenter is Dr. Jim Stout, a Presbyterian pastor who served in 5 churches and is a popular speaker and counselor to many. Besides pastoring, Dr. Stout has spoken to professional athletes, business and professional leaders, high school and college students, mental illness conferences, and other venues. He has started and led numerous support groups for those dealing with depression, anxiety, and other mental illnesses. He and his wife Leah are celebrating their 56th anniversary this June. They have 2 sons, Jim Jr. and John, and 5 energetic grandchildren. The first seminar will give you a helpful overview of depression and anxiety. It will be followed by weekly seminars on the good and bad effects of depression and anxiety, various treatments, either helpful or unhelpful, and tricks of the trade, hands-on tools and strategies. If you have questions you'd like Dr. Stout to respond to, please email him at drjimstout@gmail.com. That is drjimstout@gmail.com, so that he can discuss them at the end of his lectures. And now, as his wife, I am pleased to introduce to you Dr. Jim Stout.
Congratulations on joining us in this first of 4 YouTube seminar sessions. I salute you for having enough courage to look at yourself and the anxiety or depression that's been tormenting you perhaps for a long time. I also salute you for your openness to try some new approaches to alleviate your pain and to move ahead in your life. Are you aware of the tremendous value of humor in combating depression and anxiety? Believe it or not, the old adage is true. Laughing is like jogging on the inside. The Bible teaches that a merry heart acts like a medicine, but a broken spirit dries the bones. A merry heart makes a cheerful countenance, but by sorrow of the heart the spirit is broken. All the days of the afflicted are evil, but the person who has a merry heart has a continual feast. Speaking of humor, do you know how many depressives it takes to change a light bulb? None, because depressed people prefer the dark. Do you know how many psychiatrists it takes to change a light bulb? Only 1, but the light bulb must really want to change. Not long ago, my psychiatrist told me, Jim, you don't have an inferiority complex. You simply are inferior. Nice guy. Actually, I view myself as an expert. An expert is something like this. A man who is a legend in his own mind and is all he can think about. Actually, an expert is noted as an X is a has-been and a spurt is a drip under pressure. Maybe that describes me. Let me begin our time together by sharing some of the life experiences that make up my credentials. I grew up in a home of constant stresses. You can read about some of those details in my books. Both of my parents argued and fought nonstop. Each parent left us kids for a year. I was emotionally and sexually abused starting at age 4. This resulted in severe, ongoing depression, PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxieties, panic attacks, and an eating disorder. I've struggled with those pretty much all of my life, including now. I don't usually do this, but I'd like to read an excerpt out of my book, my mini book, called Recovering and Rebuilding from a Severe Mental Illness. It starts this way. In 1989, next to me on my motel bed, I laid lethal dosages of 2 medications and a 5th of rum. Beside the pills lay a .357 Magnum revolver. Despair had set in. Suicide was my next move. My death would be painless. Either a drug overdose or lethal shot to the head, and I debated which to use. Either way, my lifelong inner hurt and current unbearable torture would soon be over. Outward success, but inner pain. Most people saw me as a successful pastor, yet in the fall of 1988, nearly 35 years ago, I lost my desire to live. A long history of childhood emotional and sexual abuse had finally caught up with me. In addition, I struggled with other stresses and was exhausted from nonstop organizing, counseling, and meetings. In 3 of the 5 churches I had served, I'd been savaged by people who'd broken financial promises and stung me with ruthless, unwarranted criticisms. At one church, I'd even received death threats towards me, my wife, and our 2 young sons, because my preaching focused on Bible-centered theology rather than the current denominational policies and programs. But it's difficult for a pastor to defend himself. If he were to strike back at his critics or sue his church for having violated their contract with him, he would be removed from his post. In 1986, I accepted a call to a large church in California. Every program I started there exceeded my expectations, and I tingled with excitement. But, mixed with my joy, were severe depressions. They immobilized me for days at a time, yet no one ever noticed the inner desperation hiding behind my outward accomplishments. I echoed the prophet Jeremiah and cried out to God, "Why is my pain unending, and my wound grievous and incurable? Will you be to me like a deceptive brook, like a spring that fails?" Outwardly, I acted pleasant, but inside I was numb and angry and miserable. I had everything to live for, yet inwardly I despaired. Thoughts of ending my life soon blackened my mind, and I couldn't shake them off, no matter what. Although my wife and 2 sons had always been precious to me, and I found my work rewarding, I just didn't care anymore about anything or anyone. I had to escape the pain of this all-engulfing depression. When I considered the effects of my exit would have on my family and others, I could only focus on frightening, inexpressibly lonely thoughts, which only made me feel worse. As we continue, let me add this brief disclaimer. Please know that my speaking today is not intended to be psychological, psychiatric, or medical counseling. What I share will be hypothetical, spiritual, and general in nature. My words are not meant to be a substitute for your own healthcare professional, and they will refer to what I would do rather than what you should do. Please consult your own healthcare provider for your specific needs. Perhaps, my friend, you can identify with the woman in Jesus' days, quote, who was there, who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. That is in Mark's Gospel, chapter 5. One well-known mental illness survivor and writer says, quote, "Knowledge is necessity," end quote. This is so true in the realm of athletics. The reason that football teams, baseball teams, basketball teams, wrestling teams take game films of their opponents is to see the weaknesses and strengths of their opponent and develop a strategy to take specific steps to win. This first session gives an overview of depression and anxiety. Probably it is the least practicable, nevertheless, it is still very important. Google Trends lists the top 3 illnesses searched on the internet. Diabetes is number 1, depression is number 2, anxiety is number 3. Most common illness is anxiety. Of all of the hundreds of mental disorders, most mental health pros list depression, schizophrenia, and bipolar disorder as the most serious ones. The bad news, sadly, to date, is that there is no known permanent cure for either depression or anxiety. The good news, however, is that your vulnerability to depression and anxiety can be substantially lessened by using recovery strategies and tools. And you can manage your own moods to a great degree and learn to live happily, successfully, productively. The key to recovering, to getting well and staying well, is to take responsibility for your own recovering, instead of passively depending on doctors, medications, therapists, and the like. It is an important fact to remember that depression and anxiety rarely comes out of the blue. Nearly always, they have a stress-related or medically related cause. Dr. Robert Schuller said, "If it's going to be, it's up to me." Therefore, you and I have to be the case manager for our own lives, our own struggles. The Bible teaches real survivors learn wisdom from others. That's out of the book of Proverbs, centuries ago. In these coming seminar sessions, I will discuss evidence-based tools and strategies that have worked for me and countless others. This series offers specific actions you can apply to your own circumstances so that you can take back your life. These tools and strategies require action, but they're only suggestions. They are a way, not the way, to get better and stay better. These tools and strategies require action, but they are only suggestions. They are a way, not the way, to get better and stay better. Every person must find his or her own path to recovery. This is obvious. This will mean experimenting. Trial and error will give you some solutions if you persist. It will be frustrating at times, but you will learn. Maybe it'll be 2 steps forward, 1 backward, but you will make progress, and it's progress, not perfection, that counts. I have probably learned as much from my failures as my successes in battling anxieties of all kinds and depressions. I want to emphasize a motto of Alcoholics Anonymous because I recommend it to you as you listen to these sessions. Take what works and leave the rest. Let's begin our overview of depression and anxiety by understanding as best we can what they are in simple terms. Anxiety is a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. It manifests itself in various ways: worry, concern, apprehension, uneasiness, fear, fretfulness, agitation, nervousness, edginess, tenseness, trepidation, foreboding. Depression, on the other hand, has often been defined as anger turned inward. That's an old definition, but I and others prefer this definition of depression. It is the body and mind's mental and emotional responses to losses or perceived losses, such as the death of a loved one, a divorce, deteriorated relationship, a loss of a career, health in jeopardy, your reputation, or something else. What are a few of the important statistics of depression sufferers that are worth noting? Well, if you take a brain scan of a depressive patient's brain, it will show very clear structural changes. It is different than a normal brain, shape-wise, and there's a lot of blue in it. Maybe that's where we get the term the blues. So there's something organic, structurally different about a depressed brain. The wires are crossed upstairs, in essence. Physical symptoms almost always accompany clinical depression. Clinical depression, major depression, is kind of the worst kind of depression. That means gastrointestinal, joint pain, and other physical complaints. Depression is curable in many cases, but it is a chronic recurring illness which is very vulnerable to relapse. Probably 70 to 75% of people with depression will relapse. Believe it or not, 1 out of 8 women experience a major depression, twice as often as men. In one study, nearly 40 years of data show that men with depression are about twice as likely to have heart disease, including heart attacks, as the general population. That was a real eye-opener for me, and it made me pay attention to some of the physical damage that my depression could be handling onto me. That made me pay closer attention to dealing with that depression, lest the physical effects jeopardize my health even worse. Nearly 1/3 of all depressed people have a drug or alcohol abuse problem because that novocaines the pain. And the biggest danger of depression is suicide. You never can quite predict when somebody's comment or some little incident will finally break your will to live. That last little straw, you think you can tell when it'll fall on the donkey's back, but you will not know. As a matter of fact, in last week's news on TV in May, suicide is the second leading cause of death for Orange County, California youths. Females attempt suicide 2 to 3 times more often than men, but men are 4 times more successful. And lastly, the best treatment for both depression and anxiety is a combination of medications and psychotherapy. It's not one or the other, it's usually both and. What are some of the statistics of anxiety sufferers that are worth noting? To begin with, anxiety disorders are the most common mental health disorder, and they affect more than 25% of the men and 40% of women. Here's a statistic that surprised me. Adults 60 years of age and older are more likely to experience physical symptoms of anxiety than their younger counterparts. Perhaps this age group has a higher risk of their anxieties because of health changes. Anxiety can lead to various damaging conditions: depressions of various kinds, substance abuse, trouble sleeping, digestive or bowel problems, headaches or chronic pain, social isolation, problem functioning at school or work. How helpful are clergy in rescuing people with these mental and emotional struggles and helping them get better? In the United States, clergy outnumber psychiatrists almost 10 to 1. Also, for more than 20 years, studies have consistently shown that nearly 40% of the people seeking help with an emotional problem turn first to a religious professional, a much higher number than those who turn to psychiatrists, psychologists, and family physicians. Regrettably, nearly half of the mentally ill and their families, that includes those with depression, anxiety, who turn to the people of the cloth for help are badly disappointed. Half of them. One recent study done by the California Alliance for Mentally Ill acknowledges that 40% of its families questioned had sought the help of clergy, but when confronted with some kind of mental illness situation, the religious leaders were found to be last in helpfulness. Most clergy have very minimal training in counseling. They may have big hearts, but they are too often simply adding shame and blame by offering trite religious cliches like pray more, read your Bible more, or sometimes even worse, stop your sinful behavior that's causing your anxiety or depression. Trying to learn how Christian clergy viewed mental illness, a nationwide survey of pastors, mostly from mainline denominations, those are the denominations which have the most training in counseling, minimal though it might be. This survey reveals that more than 50% of religious leaders believe that demons and or sin is a major cause of a mental illness, depression, anxiety, so forth. No wonder there is such ignorance of mind dysfunction in churches today. Many clergy are simply uncomfortable with mentally disturbed individuals. Their schedules are crammed with ministerial duties, leaving little time for those who are mind damaged and can't be actively in parish activities. California psychiatrist Dwight Carlson has penned a book, Why Do Christians Shoot Their Wounded? And it explores this problem of the lack of helpfulness of clergy and church people. Let's move on now and take a look briefly at some famous people who've battled depression and anxiety. Some of their battles ended in suicide, which we'll cover in another session. Believe it or not, Abraham Lincoln, our 16th president, had incurred many losses: mother, father, children, girlfriends, and he wrote this letter to John Stuart one day in 1841. Stuart was one of his former law partners. I am now the most miserable man living. If what I feel were equally distributed to the whole human family, there would be not one cheerful face on the earth. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forebode I shall not. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better, it appears to me. Some of you may not be aware of the name Tom Johnson, but let me acquaint you to him. Tom Johnson was formerly the publisher of the Los Angeles Times and the CEO of CNN, and an article about his depression, someone else's depression, appeared on the first page of the Wall Street Journal in June 26, 2002. It, meaning depression and anxiety, sapped me of my strength, robbed me of my energy, and brought me inexplicably to the brink of suicide. Just the act of getting out of bed and into the shower each morning was tough. I was baffled by the sadness, by the loss of self-confidence, by the feeling of being trapped at the bottom of a deep, dark well. Like many others, Johnson did not seek help. He explains, I felt that going to a psychiatrist would be a sign that I was somehow defective, and stigma is another trap associated with depression. There are many others, but I will allude to a couple of others who struggle with depression or anxiety. Serena Williams, the famous female tennis U.S. Open star in '99, for instance, at age 17, won the U.S. Open. Bruce Springsteen, you can't succeed your way out of depression. By the way, as I'm speaking, I tend to slur my words somewhat. That's because I have been diagnosed with Parkinsonism, and so I battle that even with speech therapy. So hopefully you can read between the words and the slurring sometimes. Jennifer Lopez, often called JoLo, is a workaholic, has experienced many panic attacks. Carson Daly hosted The Voice on TV and is the co-host of the Today Show. Is open in sharing his panic attacks and anxiety problems. Terry Bradshaw, famous quarterback of the Pittsburgh Steelers, led them to win 4 Super Bowls. Twice he was named Most Valuable Player. He has been inducted into the NFL Hall of Fame. He's now a sports TV announcer, but he is no stranger to anxiety, panic attacks, and depression. Mike Wallace of 60 Minutes fame suffered big-time depression. Harrison Ford, the actor, same way. Britney Spears, same way, depression. Elton John, the singer, depression. Robin Williams, the actor, comedian, who later took his life, big-time depression, anxiety. Pennsylvania Democratic Senator John Fetterman had a stroke, but it involved all kinds of stress coming out of that surgery, plus his workload. Got clinically depressed, checked into Walter Reed Mental Hospital about a month ago. Beethoven, even though he was deaf, overcame that, but still struggled with depression off and on. George Handel, who composed the Messiah in 24 days, struggled with big-time depression. Martin Luther, the great reformer, after his worst depression of his whole life, finally came through and wrote A Mighty Fortress Is Our Guard. Mark Twain, Ernest Hemingway, Winston Churchill. Churchill called his depressions the black dog because it followed him everywhere. Dick Vermeil, former NFL coach. Barbara Bush, wife, former President Bush. Charles Spurgeon, one of the greatest preachers of the 1800s. He and his wife both suffered severe depressive episodes. Then, of course, there are Bible heroes who were angry, hurt, depressed, doubtful, skeptical of God, and even suicidal. Catch some of these, people that you may not be aware of. Job, of course, said this, I despise my life, I would not live forever. My days have no meaning. Have I not wept for those in trouble? Has not my soul grieved for the poor? Yet when I hoped for good, evil came. When I looked for light, then came darkness. The churning inside me never stops. Days of suffering confront me. Elijah the prophet said, I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. King David, who wrote many of the Psalms, said, How long must I wrestle with my thoughts, and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? You keep my eyes from closing. I was too troubled to speak. Jeremiah, who was a pastor and a prophet, wrote this in the book of Lamentations. He, meaning God, has driven me away and made me walk in darkness rather than light. Indeed, he has turned his hand against me again and again all day long. He, God, has besieged me and surrounded me with bitterness and hardship. He has made me dwell in darkness like those long dead. He has walled me in so I cannot escape. He has weighed me down with change. I have been deprived of peace. So I say, my splendor is gone and all that I had hoped for from the Lord. My soul is downcast within me. And then the great Apostle Paul of New Testament times wrote, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart. We do not want you to be uninformed, brothers and sisters, about the troubles we experienced in the province of Asia. We were under great pressure, far beyond our ability to endure, so that we despaired of life itself. Indeed, we felt we had received the sentence of death. Those are in the book of Romans and the book of 2 Corinthians. Moving along, untreated symptoms of severe anxiety and depression can worsen and cause very, very serious harm to both mental and physical health. Let's look at some of the anxiety symptoms. And you on your own time can go to the internet and check out various books on all the symptoms of depression and anxiety, but let me just focus on a few of the symptoms of these disorders. Some anxiety is normal and not bad for you. It may focus your attention and motivate you, but the anxiety one experiences with an anxiety disorder involves excessive fear or anxiety, and it is much harder to control, and it can interfere with normal functioning. Several types of anxiety disorders are involving different focuses. The most common are panic disorder, specific phobias, like fear of spiders, fear of heights, so forth. Anxiety disorder, being around people, separation anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder. But of all those disorders of anxiety, they can be broken down into 3 types of symptoms: cognitive or mental or thinking symptoms. Disturbance in thinking such as rumination, trouble concentrating, fear, and where it means doing instant replays over and over and over again. Cognitive symptoms, there are bodily or somatic symptoms, which are physical complaints like rapid heart rate, shortness of breath, trembling, tingling, headaches, nausea, cold and clammy skin, dry mouth, dizziness, a choking sensation, and trouble sleeping. And also the third kind of symptom are emotional symptoms, which include real restlessness, irritability, frustration, and crying. Anxiety treatment. The good news is that anxiety disorders are, in fact, the most treatable of all the mental health disorders. Studies show that nearly 70% of the people with depression also suffer from anxiety disorder. Talk therapy, psychotherapy, is probably the best treatment for most people. Sometimes medications can be an add-on. But untreated anxiety disorders increase your risk for heart disease and digestive disease. These disorders may also weaken your body's immune system, making you far more susceptible to infections or cancer. Now let's take a look at clinical depression symptoms. Although depression may occur only one time during your life, usually people have multiple episodes of depression. And I'll go through a list of some of them symptoms. Feelings of sadness, feelings of emptiness or unhappiness, angry outbursts, irritability or frustration, even over small matters, loss of interest or pleasure in normal activities such as sex, sleep disturbances, including insomnia or sleeping too much, tiredness and lack of energy so that even a small task takes extra effort, changes in appetite, often reduced appetite and weight loss, but also increased cravings for food and weight gain in some people. Anxiety, agitation, or restlessness. For example, excessive worrying, pacing, hand-wringing, or an inability to sit still. Slowed thinking, speaking, or bodily movements. Feelings of unworthiness or guilt, fixating on past failures, or blaming yourself for things that are not your responsibility. Trouble thinking, concentrating, making decisions, remembering things. Frequent thoughts of death, suicidal thoughts, suicidal attempts or suicide. Unexplained physical problems such as back pain or headaches. For some people, depression symptoms are so severe it's obvious something isn't right. Other people generally feel miserable or unhappy without really knowing why. Sort of to underscore some of these symptoms, let me mention a couple. When you are depressed, your energy is nil. Brushing your teeth or walking to the mailbox to pick up a letter is a major event. There just isn't much energy. Motivation is nil. It's hard to make a decision about anything. Your memory is nil. You can go to the grocery store with a list of 10 items written down and you'll forget 6 of them at least. Your enjoyment is nil. Someone could offer you a free trip to Maui, Hawaii for a month, expense paid, and you couldn't enjoy it. Also, isolation. People and phone. It's very difficult to talk with people when you are depressed. You isolate because you either don't have the energy to carry on a conversation or you don't want to risk someone will say something that might sink your boat. If you are currently struggling with depression or anxiety or some addiction, there's an interesting little article that will help you gauge how much progress you're making. And by the way, before I get to that, Dr. Beck advises people to take that test every week. You won't memorize it, but it'll help you to see if you're improving or getting worse. Portia Nelson was a singer, composer, writer, and she wrote a little article called Autobiography in 5 Chapters. It's used in many 12-step groups to measure the degree of recovery from a mental illness or an addiction. Here we go. An autobiography in 5 chapters. You can sort of evaluate where you are. Chapter 1, I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am helpless. It isn't my fault. It takes forever to find a way out. Chapter 2, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I can't believe I'm in the same place, but it isn't my fault. It still takes a long time to get out. Chapter 3, I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it there. I still fall in. It's a habit. My eyes are open. It's my fault. I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street. There's a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5. I walk down another street. Let's take a look now at some of the causes of anxiety and depression. I've attended lectures by some of the top experts in the world on these topics on depression and bipolar disorder and anxiety and PTSD for both Navy SEALs, professional athletes, and physicians of all type, experts in these fields. I've learned some things, and I come up with about a 70-30% rule. 70% of an anxiety or depression is stress-induced, some kind of a trauma. 30% of depressions and anxieties are caused by something medical. Let me explain. Most surgeries involve depression, no matter what the surgery is. Also, the anesthesia stays in your body up to a year. That can cause that. And there's a natural letdown when you pump up for a surgery and then the letdown when it's over, or an athletic event. Various illnesses such as diabetes, dementia, thyroid, and other illnesses can contribute to depression. So there's a medical cause. Those and other illnesses can cause depression or anxiety. Medications, legal and illegal, can cause depression, anxiety, and even suicide. Addictions such as alcohol, sexual eating disorders, workaholism, all those are all stresses. Believe it or not, some antidepressants given to patients to stop depression or anxiety can actually cause depression or suicide or homicide in some people. Not many, but some. It's interesting that a lot of our mass shootings have been caused by people on antidepressants. Just an interesting fact. Marijuana, drugs. The kind of marijuana that's available today is probably 90% stronger than it was in the 60s and 70s. That can cause depression. Alcohol can cause depression. Overeating can cause depression. So those are physical causes of depression. I believe there could be a demonic component of Satan can cause depression. He can cause people to really have difficult times viewing themselves in life. So genes are but a small part of the puzzle, but they're not determinative. Our lifestyle and our environment have a far greater impact on our risk for depression and anxiety than our genes. 70% of the stress, of the anxiety, of the depression is caused by stresses of all kinds. Strained relationships, addictions, alcohol, sexual eating disorders, workaholism, gambling, sexual abuse, victimizations, all kinds of toxins, a job loss, the death of a loved one, the breakup with a boyfriend, neglect, abandonment, letdowns after some kind of a success at work or in sports. All of these can cause a letdown, a depression. So that's an interesting way to look at the cause of depression. In some ways, it helps to see the cause. In other ways, now that I know what may have caused it, I still have to figure, what do I do now about it to get better, to overcome this, to beat it, to win over it? And genes are only a small part of the problem. Example, every man has a prostate cancer in his body. Every woman has a breast cancer molecule in their body. They can go a whole lifetime without getting breast cancer or prostate cancer, but put them under enough stress, and that can activate that. It's a complex interaction between environment, genes, and stress. A long-standing scientific study called the Genome Project studied all this for years and found that there's a complex interaction between genes and environment. A book called The Body Keeps Score explained the role of lifestyle in having a greater impact even than our genes. A study funded by the U.S. National Institute of Mental Health reported a couple of years ago, after examining numerous studies as well as their own, quote, their analysis of 14 studies involving nearly 11,000 people found that the depression gene did not show a relationship to increased risk for depression, either alone or in interaction with stressful events. However, it did find a strong association between the number of stressful events and the risk of depression. What are the different types of anxieties and depressions? Well, there are many, but let me just underscore a couple of them. SAD, seasonal affective disorder. People living in parts of the world that have diminished sunlight, like Alaska, Maine, places like that, they're much more susceptible. They need to use light therapy in other ways. Trauma, people who've been through sexual abuse, neglect, abandonment, health, all the kinds of trauma can cause depressions. Postpartum after childbirth, sin can induce certain types of depression. If you get drunk and drive down the road and total a van filled with a young family and kill everyone, obviously you're going to feel a lot of suffering and guilt and depression. There can be psychotic depressions, catatonic depressions, medication or drug-induced depressions, and disease-induced depressions. Parkinson's disease is one which I have. My best suggestion for you at this point is always have your doctor check you out for medical issues, because they could be a big part of your depression or your anxiety. Let me conclude with some of the differences between male and female depression. Archibald Hart, in his good book Unmasking Male Depression, lists the differences in depression. And men and women experience depression, at least in the initial stages, differently. Here are some of those differences. For male depression, blames others for his depression, acts out on his inner turmoil, needs to maintain control at all costs, overly hostile, irritable, attacks when hurt, tries to fix his depression by problem solving or working harder, or developing more hobbies, turns to TV, sports, sex, alcohol, feels shamed by his depression, becomes a compulsive timekeeper, terrified to confront his weakness, tries to maintain a strong male image, tries to act out away his depression, turns to alcoholism and other addictions. Of note, the book The Friendless American Male, authored by David Smith, reveals that the vast majority of American men do not have a single close male friend whom they can call when in need, and its findings have been replicated in more than 200 studies on men. Now, female depression. Blames herself for her depression, turns her feelings inward, has trouble maintaining control, always tries to be nice, withdraws when hurt, fixes her depression by trying harder, turns to food, friends, and emotional needs, feels guilty about her depression, procrastinates, delays deadlines, exaggerates and obsesses about her weaknesses, disintegrates at the slightest failure, tries to think through her depression, increases appetite, and weight goes up. In conclusion, I mentioned earlier in a book about that suicide attempt of mine, I got rescued by a prostitute. She was making her rounds. I guess it was a Friday night, not too far from our home here, probably maybe a dozen miles away. She was making her rounds, knocking on doors, trying to drum up business. As I was preparing to take out my life, she knocked on my door. I don't know why, but I got immediately enraged. I swore at her, told her to get out, and then I called the motel manager. And that little break in my concentration was enough to save me from taking my life. Interesting how God can use even a prostitute. Let me leave you with 4 quick tips on recovering. We'll cover these in depth later. One is to make your own hope box. Get a shoebox and collect various items. I have one. And when you're really down, open it up and go through it. Pictures of you and the family, CDs of music, poems, and appreciation notes and letters, various mementos, a coffee mug, a pine tree. I asked my wife to write down 8 reasons she loves me. Other things that can put in your hope box to give you hope when you're really edgy. Another tool would be to soothe yourself, nurture yourself with one activity this week. Soothe yourself. Get your nails cut, get a haircut, soak in the tub, take a walk. Another is to do one task every day. It'll give you a sense of accomplishment, of being somewhat in control. And then a last tip is read one joke a day. Go to the internet or go to a joke book and read one joke to yourself. It'll even be better if you read it to somebody else. A laugh away keeps the sad away, in some ways. Friends, thank you for listening. God bless you. Bye-bye.
This overview of depression and anxiety concludes our first of 4 sessions. The following 3 weeks' lectures will focus on practical applications. Next week, we will discuss the positive and negative effects of anxiety and depression.